The most violent clashes in the history of world wars continue at full speed on the territory of Ukraine. The effects of ground attacks in the Donbas region have gradually shifted towards Ukraine's southern front lines in recent days. While the Russian Navy can no longer approach the Ukrainian shores, the Crimean and southern fronts are heating up. Footsteps of the Ukrainian army are now felt on the streets of Crimea. Ukraine is taking action in the south for the big offensive and is starting to push the Crimea's gates. Kherson and Melitopol are seen as the main gates on the way to the Crimea this week. The Ukrainian army's breakthrough into the Russian front lines in Kherson and Melitopol shocked Putin's army. The Ukrainians began to literally clamp down on the Russian troops, especially around the Dnipro River. The Russians, on the other hand, are trying to turn to both Kherson and the Dnipro region with small attack groups in this region. But the loss of many of their boats in the Dnipro River by the Russians gave the Ukrainians the advantage in this area. Ukrainian forces, on the other hand, are still continuing their reconnaissance and detection efforts in and around the Dnipro River. In addition, the efforts of the Ukrainian forces to stop the Russians continues in the Kherson region. In line with these efforts, the Ukrainians launched a striking operation around the Kherson region and Dnipro. The Russians did not expect this countermove of the Ukrainians at all. The left bank of the Dnipro is about to be almost completely cleared of Russians by the raiding attempts of the Ukrainians. Let's witness these striking moments in this critical area, which includes Kherson and Dnipro. Without wasting any time, the Ukrainian armed forces began to break through an area of about 20 to 30 kilometers on the left bank of the Kherson region. Russian forces came under heavy attacks of the Ukrainian army in this region. The huge Ukrainian army of about 20,000 troops is making a serious breakthrough into the Russian-controlled areas of Kherson, with HIMARS troops and tanks. The efforts of the Ukrainian armed forces to break through the Russian defense lines became very effective over time. In particular, the number of attacks by the Russian army from the Kinburn spit was significantly reduced as a Russian ammunition supply and storage point was hit. At the moment, the Russians do not have a strong support in these areas, and even ground movement seems rather difficult for Russian troops as the Ukrainian armed forces are trying to keep the isthmus connecting the mainland of the left bank with the Kinburn Peninsula under fire control. However, in order to get out of this heavy fire and pressure, Russian troops started bombing attacks against civilian Ukrainian targets in the Kherson region. In short, the Kherson region is literally under the ring of fire. In addition, Ukraine's defense ministry recently announced that Russian troops had withdrawn from the city of Nova Kakhovka in the south of the Kherson region, although there was no increase in clashes there. It was also observed that the Russians looted the valuables of the residents before their withdrawal. But the head of the Kherson region denied the reports that Russian troops had withdrawn from Nova Kakhovka. Vladimir Saldo announced that the Russian troops in Nova Kakhovka and other deployments on the left bank of the Dnipro River remained in their positions. If we look at the latest situation in Nova Kakhovka, we can actually see that the Russians are gradually withdrawing. More than 20,000 people live on Nova Kakhovka, among them are many retired and people with low mobility. The city is bombarded almost daily by Ukrainian artillery. Therefore, it makes little sense for Russian troops to stay in the area because the Ukrainian armed forces made it very difficult for the Russians in this area with the additional military reinforcements they received from the Kherson region. So why do the Russian authorities deny the withdrawal of Russian troops from Nova Kakhovka? Actually, this can be explained quite simply. If you are aware, Ukrainian forces are threatening one of the most strategic areas of the war by successfully attacking Nova Kakhovka by establishing a dominance area in Kinburn. This is the peninsula of Crimea which the Russians violently forced to annex. But whatever happens, even if 100 years of trench warfare tactics reoccur in the mud of eastern Ukraine, the planned liberation of Russian-occupied Crimea in part on the promised advanced Western armored fleet, at least for now, we're seeing how much the aging M113S and the Russian R-765 almost spearhead combat vehicles compared to their more modern successors are involved in combat. It is extraordinary and terrifying to see this. Ukraine clearly manages with the best armor at hand, even if it is far from ideal. On the other hand, Russia continues to strengthen occupied Crimea in anticipation of Ukrainian attacks, according to an important source south of the town of. The Russians are increasing their defensive fortifications, which continue on the western side of the isthmus. But Russia is not just building new fortifications along the Sea of Azov coastline. Satellite images show Russian forces at the Arabat fortress at the southern end of the Arabat Spit. It was built by Ottoman forces in the 17th century and hosted clashes in the 1853 to 1856 Crimean War, the Russian Civil War, and the Second World War. More recently, Russian forces have occupied this fort's annexed Crimea in 2014. Satellite images once again revealed the trench lines and battle positions around the fort as it prepared for battle. While the Russians were preparing not to lose Crimea to the Ukrainians, a striking situation occurred on the peninsula. A Ukrainian flag was hoisted on a communications tower in Crimea this week, according to a senior official. Colonel Vladislav Nazarov, spokesman for the Southern Operational Command of the Ukrainian Army, made it clear that there was a Ukrainian flag flying in the village of Razivka in the Sudak district of Crimea. After these striking statements, it was observed that the resistance against the Russian administration grew in the Black Sea Peninsula, which was illegally annexed by President Vladimir Putin in 2014. Tensions have been escalating in recent weeks as Ukraine signals its intention to retake Crimea. A Ukrainian official reported that his country is preparing assault brigades to retake occupied territories, including Crimea. It is feared that such a move would be a red line for Russia, and Putin could use his country's nuclear capabilities to defend in the region because the Russian leader does not want to give the Crimean Peninsula back to the Ukrainians in any way. However, the striking military preparations of the Ukrainian armed forces in recent days are described as the harbinger of possible attacks expected in Crimea. If you remember, the Ukrainian armed forces had been blockading the peninsula with air strikes almost every day for about 2 weeks. In these striking attacks, the Ukrainian forces had repeatedly attacked the strategic military bases of the Russians on the peninsula using unmanned aerial vehicles. Russian officials in Crimea and residents of the peninsula were greatly alarmed by the success of attacks by the Ukrainians. Very soon, such events will no longer surprise the Russians, for the blue and yellow flags seem to float calmly over every building on the peaceful and free Ukrainian peninsula. Because, like Russian leader Putin, Ukrainian leader Zelensky constantly states in his statements that he will not give up on Crimea. Even the most recent Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, recently promised to retake Crimea, located in the south of mainland Ukraine. Alexander Formenchik, head of the People's Assembly of Crimea, expressed his belief that if any attempt is made to return Crimea to Ukraine's control, a global nuclear war will break out immediately. The Russian leader was also putting forward his nuclear threats in this regard at the time. But Boris Bondarev, a former Russian diplomat who publicly resigned in May 2022 due to the invasion of Ukraine, stressed that he believes Putin's nuclear threats are a bluff. Actually, Bondarev's statements are somewhat correct because the Ukrainians took back parts of their territory and there was no nuclear retaliation in response from the Russians. It is not known whether Ukraine's unexpected advances and striking offensive operations on the front lines will push the Russians to use nuclear weapons. But the approaches and policies of the West and Ukrainian allies such as the USA and international organizations such as the EU and NATO are also vital. In other words, if Russia loses Crimea and leaves this war with a defeat, the parties that will prevent the Kremlin administration and Russian leader Vladimir Putin from turning to nuclear weapons as a last resort are Ukraine's allies. But we hope that no nuclear weapons will be used in this war and that the Ukrainians can regain their territorial integrity and independence." A shocking move came from the Ukrainian army. Thanks to this move against Russia, the Ukrainian army took the war to a different point. Russia had nowhere to run in solitaire. This train, which was Russia's last hope, was destroyed by Ukraine's unbelievable operation. This event once again showed the whole world how far ahead Ukraine was in the war and the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The Russian army started to withdraw. Following these steps, Putin put the entire army on the defensive. This situation started to drive the problems of the Russian army to a different point. In order to prevent the shortage of ammunition and supplies experienced by the Russian army in the Ukrainian region, Putin took action to send an armored ammunition train, but at the end of this train stunt, the whole world, it was constantly evident that the Russian army was in great difficulties in the Ukraine region, but especially because of the ammunition and supplies left behind in the areas of their retreat. The Russian army was at a loss. It was no longer in a position to take the slightest step against Ukraine. This gave Putin a different idea. He decided to gather forces to launch a much more powerful offensive against the Ukrainian army. But Ukraine, realizing this, decided to make a very different move. If the ammunition coming to the Russian troops in this region is blocked, the Russian army will not be able to take the slightest step. The Ukrainian army has started to take steps to corner Russia by actively using recent intelligence developments. Ukrainian soldiers have taken action to cut many of the advantages Russia has gained in the light of the information brought by many agents in the Russian army. It was learnt that a very large ammunition train would be coming towards this region. This information was very critical for Ukrainian soldiers because there were very few areas with railroads in the Ukrainian region, and this was the only one where ammunition could be transported by armored train. Therefore, the Ukrainian army decided to organize an operation in this region using many explosives in its possession. The blow to this train was the blow that would affect all Russian soldiers in the Ukrainian region. First of all, the Ukrainian army started combining the area around this train track. As a result of this scans, a Ukrainian village near the area attracted attention. Ukrainian soldiers decided to make the critical move for the operation by attracting pro-Ukrainian army supporters in this village. This village had not been occupied since the beginning of the war. Therefore, the Ukrainian army was going to conduct the operation through this village. Russia's reconnaissance and observation units in the region moved in to check the train's route. Aware of this, Ukrainian soldiers started moving everything that would be used in this operation towards the Ukrainian village. This was one of the most important parts of this operation. The Ukrainian army moved when the Russian reconnaissance and observation units moved away from the area. It lined up C4s on the section of the tracks. The Ukrainian army, which moved to use a light infantry in this area, had made a very serious preparation. It installed a rocket launcher near this area. This rocket launcher was important for the Ukrainian army because a very high explosive power was needed to destroy the armored train. The operation started with the sounds of the train. The Ukrainian army first prepared 2 controls of the C4s. When the train got closer, the tracks were blown up. The Russian ammunition train realized this and hit the brakes. This rookie mistake by the Ukrainian army jeopardized the whole operation in an instant. Ukrainian soldiers directed all the explosive power they had towards the train. The Russian army was stunned. Some of the officers inside the train tried to respond by taking their weapons, but they were unable to counter disadvantages. Situation of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army used rocket-propelled grenade launchers to hit the train, one after the other, forcing it to overturn. After that, the remaining Russian soldiers began to flee and call for reinforcements. Thanks to the jammers used by the Ukrainian army in this area, the Russian army could not call for support. The Ukrainian soldiers started to carry all the ammunition for the Russian army with the vehicles they brought in the back. With this incident, a very strong blow was dealt to the Russian army, which already had to deal with serious problems in this region. While this operation of Ukrainian soldiers made a great echo all over the world, Putin literally went crazy. Russian inspectors who determined the damage caused by the Ukrainian army determined that it was approximately $15 million. This situation allowed Russian soldiers who were already experiencing troubled days to move towards more troubled days. After this operation, Putin signed decisions that shocked the whole world, adding a new one to Russia's troubled periods in foreign policy. There is not the slightest thing that can be done anymore. In the aftermath of these events, Putin has decided to build a very strong wall between him and the countries that supported Ukraine. This will now allow Putin to face a very serious regional challenge with this crisis. Putin, who has no allies left, has started to prepare the ground for Russia to evolve into war states. This is what Putin's misguided policies have led to. Once again, as Russia has entered a troubled period with many countries in Asia. For these reasons, the Russian army has been unable to take the slightest step against Ukraine. The biggest reason for this is Putin's wrong policies. Putin's constant aggressive policy against Ukraine is preventing Russia from achieving victory because on-balance and continuously aggressive policies and irrational steps are putting the Russian army into a bigger crisis every day. According to war analysts, the main reason why the Ukrainian army can take such drastic steps as Russia, which has become isolated in foreign policy. In other words, Putin's corrupt policies are indirectly the reason why Ukraine receives so much support. Many countries have taken cover against Putin, who is constantly pursuing harsher and more troubling policies. These countries are moving to stand against the Russian army, not because they support the Ukrainian army. The main reason for this is that the Russian army has been deploying troops to critical location and taking very different steps on the nuclear issue, especially in the recent past. Putin has started to threaten Ukraine and many of the countries that support Ukraine with nukes at the slightest of it. As these threats continued, it was decided that it was necessary to stand up to Putin, and the Ukrainian army is leading the way. Ukraine is currently the country that can stand most firmly against Putin's instability. Therefore, the Ukrainian army is about to receive a very different kind of support. This situation, which will completely undermine Russia's regional power and especially its steps in Ukraine, now allows Russia to be cornered if things go this way. The Ukrainian army is about to put Russia in a very big crisis. This situation will ensure that the impact of Russia's fragile economy, especially in recent periods, will be felt. This period of economic crisis that Russia has entered has now become much more troubling. According to war analysts, it has become a matter of time for Russia to face these problems. And this is about to lay the groundwork for a change of power in Russia. There is some good news. As you know, over the last several days, the situation in the vicinity of Zolder has been very tense. The Russians tried to capitalize on the Ukrainian tactical retreat and breach the Ukrainian defense using momentum. They conducted a heavy assault on the salt mines area in the central part of the city and managed to get a toehold there. However, today the Ukrainians prepared an attack feast, returned control over the Arkansas tourist and sanatorium areas, and pushed the Russians back to the eastern part of the city. And this is how it happened. Last time I told you that the Russians reached the Ukrainian defense line but did not breach it. The Russians largely continued to operate in the buffer zones to the south and east of Soldau. Also, geolocated footage from the region showed the presence of a Wagner Group fighter at the Artem Sold tourist area in central Soldau. The Russians tried to expand control over the region and started attacking Ukrainian positions near the salt mines. 1, 2, 3. Despite these attacks, Ukrainian forces have been able to hold the ground and repel the advances of the Russian forces. As the Russian forces decreased, the number of attacks around Bakhmut transferred more Wagner forces to the Solder area and opened more lines of attacks here. The Ukrainians responded reciprocally. According to the Centralian reports, the Ukrainian military has transferred 2 additional platoons to the area to ensure the stability of the situation. After that, the Ukrainian 46th Mobile Brigade launched a counterattack over the night with the goal of restoring control over the tourist area and railways. As a result, they regained lost positions to the north of the railways. So now the Russians have no opportunity to go into the residential area. A Ukrainian military correspondent posted a geolocated picture of himself in front of the Solder salt mines, indicating that the Ukrainian troops are now in control of this part of the settlement and continue to repel Russian attacks towards the mines. A spokesperson for the Ukrainian Eastern Group of Forces emphasized that Ukrainian troops are not withdrawing from solidarity. The Ukrainian General Staff has also reported that Ukrainian troops are successfully defending the settlement. Russian analysts provide a similar evaluation of the situation. They largely agree that at the moment there is no evidence of the withdrawal of the armed forces of Ukraine. Some sources also say that the Ukrainians attacked the Russian checkpoints in the eastern part of the city, but further details will be known later. When it comes to the area around Solder, the Russians continued conducting combat reconnaissance operations in an effort to set conditions for attacking Ukrainian flanks. First of all, the Russians continued fixing Ukrainian troops from the north in order to assault other settlements on the line. And today they tried to advance in the direction of Krasnopoliansky and Seal Station. Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians were repelled, never reaching the approach us, while Russian sources claim that the operation was successful as they established control over the European amount and now have direct fire control over a section of a highway to Blahodad. If you look at the 3D map, we can see that the slope of the mount can hardly be detected. The Russians have been moving here relatively freely since they captured Yakovlevka, so the only new achievement could have been establishing a permanent presence in the region. However, this is highly doubtful, especially given that Russian sources themselves also report on Ukrainian airstrikes. A Russian source reported that the Ukrainians are using 5 Su-25 seconds and 2 MiG-29 tactical aircraft to fire at the offensive areas of the Russian forces in the Solder area, in particular European amount. Lastly, some sources indicate that the Wagner forces are fighting on the streets in Krasnohorivka and that they have taken complete control of Horodnia. The Institute for the Study of War assessed the situation and concluded that there are not enough observable confirmations to corroborate these extensive claims. So no changes to the front line happened here. Overall, the Ukrainians restored full control over their main defense line inside Soldau, and they have reportedly conducted more counterattacks east of the city. Such actions signified that the Ukrainians attempted to break the momentum of Russian advances along the entire perimeter, which should result in faster stabilization of the front line. On top of that, heavy engagement of aviation in the region strongly suggested that the Russians are given no chance to advance towards the Ukrainian flanks.